side event. And now we have recording in progress. So welcome everyone to this UNGA side event about the Effective Development Cooperation Partnership. And of course, then also an event taking place ahead of the summit that we will have in December in Geneva later on this year. Convening partners to reflect on how we can strengthen both trust and transform the way we work together for better. And we very much hope to see many of you and many, many more there. Because you might have seen that UNDP last week launched the Human Development Report, one of the many reports that we have seen lately, and many of you also see what it looks like on the ground across countries in the world of today. Problems mounting on top of each other. So effective development cooperation is certainly more needed than ever before. So thanking all of you who are here today and for the first session of the UN General Assembly that we also have taking place this week. Some 193 nations are arriving in New York. It is the 77th session. But I was about then to say that in the first session, we only had 51 nations gathering in London back in 1946. And now then 193 sessions with close to 100 represented at the head of state level. They will discuss, as we know, some of the most burning questions facing us as an international community, from the climate crisis to war and peace, to the fallout of the widening inequalities and the social fissures that result because of the situation that people and countries are facing. This is the space that not only brings nations together, but also helps to keep them together, or at least within earshot as they navigate shared challenges and in variable disagreement, as we have seen throughout the years and not least throughout the past year. There has rarely been a greater need for this space, nor more different points to try and connect. As the latest edition of our Human Development Report, as I referred to, explores, we really see unsettled lives in uncertain times. We see political, financial, and environmental pressures straining the system and the solidarity it is built on and sustains. And this challenge is a big part of what leads us to work with what we will discuss and present to you here today. As part of the 2020 and 2022 work program, the Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation collectively decided to take a thoughtful look at what we mean by an effective multilateral system. Something indeed that the Secretary General himself has turned to with a high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism due to the report in the next few months. Our starting point is effectiveness, the effectiveness principles decided upon way back, that is country ownership, inclusive partnership, mutual accountability and transparency. And then a focus on results. And this is also what we say in the Human Development Report. We need to double down our investments to make people believe in the future. So we hope that you agree that there is much to learn, taking the principles as lens for such an analysis, not least the idea that how partners engage with the multilateral system also has a major bearing on how effectively it can perform for us. And perhaps you also would agree that the past years, even though we have decided on these principles, this is not actually what we see on the ground. Because without thoughtful investment and a basic commitment to high qualitative ODA as the basis many times for broader development cooperation, we struggle to maintain a system that helps to build trust between people and nations and sources development solutions for partners from across the globe. And that combines effective approaches, delivering and sustainable impact through real local ownership with efficient systems in place. As our work and discussions with many of you here show, there is no substitute for this investment and this commitment, and our existing efforts through other channels and modalities hold valuable lessons for us and for how we can also make sure that the multilateral system is working effectively for us as this convening space, as this policy space that provides partners with new options and solutions for navigating issues collectively that they cannot contend with individually. So very much looking forward to this discussion here today, but also the discussions that will be ongoing towards the important meeting in December. Without further delay, I will hand over to our lead author, Graham Carrington, to walk us through some of the interim findings. So over to you, Graham.
Yes, thank you very much, and very good afternoon to everybody. And as we said, we're going to take a quite quick look, leaving lots of room for discussion at some of the work we have been doing, looking at the issues around the partner perspectives on an effective multilateral system. And as we just mentioned, this is the interim report. Full report will be coming out soon. And just to reiterate, we welcome ongoing feedback and discussion. I don't think this is intended to be the first, of course, it's not intended to be the first and last word. This is an ongoing debate. Just a quick word on why and how. As we said, this is very much part of the Global Partnerships work programme. This study was intended to be a contribution to this work, with the objective of helping us to better frame an understanding of effective donorship around, and some of the perceptions of that around multilateral organisations. In terms of how, we did a literature review. There's a lot of literature, very rich tapestry of literature out there, as people know. And we drew on a variety of sources, including the Global Partnership's own data. And then we also did a series of online consultations with a cross-section of stakeholders, representing, in the end, 20 entities drawn from across different stakeholder groups. So just looking at some of the existing findings, going through some of them quite quickly, I think one of the things we found is, it is important to recognize that financing through multilaterals remains stable in many ways and has continued to grow over time in overall volumes, suggesting that it is seen as an important mechanism for the provision of support and spending ODA. And then the Global Partnership's own data, as well as from this graph on the right, from DESA, shows that the multilateral system is an effective mechanism, and sometimes more effective than expenditure just through bilateral channels. This graph shows that UN agencies performed well, for example, on issues related to the use of country frameworks and transparency. That's not to say, of course, that there isn't always room for improvement in a number of other areas, but basically the system does work and has been shown to. Going through some of our findings related to the principles, just a very quick look through them. Multilaterals were often perceived as being well aligned, and are perceived as being well aligned with local efforts. And in fact, that in the discussions we had, it was given as one of the top 3 reasons for working with multilaterals. The sort of issue around building national ownership. Also, just to note that there was very strong support for the concept, as you'd probably expect, for the concept of national ownership at all levels and across all types of respondents that we spoke to. But there was perhaps a more nuanced discussion about what that might mean in terms of support, because national ownership in some contexts was recognised by bilaterals as challenging. It was challenging to work with governments in some contexts, particularly in very insecure or politically difficult situations. And some of our partners that we spoke to talked about that in those contexts, they actually found funding through multilaterals as a useful way of maintaining and continuing to support national ownership, even where they couldn't provide direct funding, perhaps to a member state or to a government. And that's perhaps an important point to recognise. Then in terms of mutual accountability, we had quite a lot of discussions around this. And there was quite, it's recognising that there was recognition that the multilateral system was quite good these days of transparency and accountability in general, but there was a discussion around how to strengthen and build mutual accountability, including issues around more active roles or the maintenance of active roles and feedback for groups such as civil society. But also there was some specific mention around the role of parliaments and auditors, for example. That came up in discussions. And the need to perhaps look at mechanisms and ways to continue to do that sort of work. People recognise that work's been done around this issue, but there was discussion about how to meaningfully strengthen it in all kinds of different ways. And then just looking at inclusive partnerships, without exception, I think one of the key strengths, the perceived key strengths of the UN system is the convening power of the UN. The convening power of the UN system, both at country level, but also, obviously more at international level. And that came out consistently as a key issue by all the people we spoke to. And that's even despite recognition of some of the challenges that we all know we face at an international level, or maybe even because of the challenges we face at an international level. In terms of building partnerships, there was recognition of the work done, but also a strong feeling that it's very important to keep doing this. Partnerships are not a static thing, and the space for them isn't, and that there's a need to keep going and keep maintaining and building space for interaction. The important role of resident coordinators in relation to this at country level was noted, and there was recognition, I think, of some of the gains made around this area, but the need to also continue to consolidate those. And then, as we mentioned, the focus on results, we didn't put it first, but of course it comes up as a consistently, the major issue. And I think there was widespread recognition, including, amongst development partners in particular, of the important role of the UN in collective efforts around the Sustainable Development Goals and crisis response, particularly perhaps in relation to challenging environments or fragile, what we sometimes call fragile environments. That was, that came out consistently. The power of multilaterals and the role of the UN system and its normative role in terms of the promotion of values and standards and rights at a country level or on particular themes and issues was also raised. So just going on just to say that the whole issue around the multilateral system as a space for development policy came up, and that had three aspects really. Its role as a convening space, bringing together member states and partners. Also, secondly, as a way of collectively implementing decisions and bringing life to those decisions, which people agree on. And then thirdly, the whole thing around being a repository of norms and standards, and if you like, being able to broker those even in difficult contexts. The issue around also what was mentioned by development partners was kind of three broad themes which we identified in our work around the role of the system, and that was the kind of issues around country ownership and access. So the issue around country ownership and also bridge building, issues around the fact though that development partners do have their own policy objectives and agendas which they wish to pursue, but also recognition of the international norms and values as a core concept. There was strong recognition of that. In our thinking, we tried to look at this, in a way that we sometimes look at objectives. There are sometimes competing objectives, and I think we all recognise this. And trade-offs can be quite difficult to manage. So in the diagram above, we tried to just introduce. This is obviously can be read more about in the report. We tried to introduce the concept of a trilemma. So rather than just thinking of a dilemma where one looks at one option against another, we looked a little bit at a trilemma where the pursuit of two objectives can sometimes preclude a third. And we've obviously built those into this. So the issue around country access, foreign policy objectives, and international norms and objectives. Perhaps just to give an example of that, For example, one example would be COVID, issues around COVID vaccines. There was widespread international agreement of the value and importance of vaccine development and distribution, and that that would protect both countries, but it would also protect everybody. But there was also perhaps something which was competing, was the need in some cases to also protect patent rights, yeah. And in some ways, that trilemma had to be managed, and in a sense, it was partially offset by mechanisms, for example, within COVAX. So the space was able, there was negotiation around those issues. Another quick example might be that of a development partner entering into an agreement with a partner country for managing asylum applicants, but which was then prohibited and challenged by an international court against norms and treaty obligations. And again, the kind of issue there for multilateral space is how it helps to sort of deal with those issues and help with de-risking and collective action. Just moving on, we're of time. Just issues around building on lessons learned, and particularly the funding compact. And that's to say that the funding compact has made and is making a difference. All development partners were aware of the compact and its basic intent, and particularly the importance of putting development financing on a much surer, robust and consistent footing, and the use of pooled resources, the importance of core funding and multi-year commitments. But perhaps also, though, important to then note that multilateral finance still in the shallows. There's an ongoing need. Despite this, there's an ongoing need to broaden and deepen funding, and ensure that we continue to focus on the sustainable development goals, in their broadest sense. And unfortunately, need to remember that 90% of core funding recently was still provided by relatively few countries, and that's an issue we have to work on. I think as part of that, though, just to mention that there were examples of how development partners, and this came up, were being quite creative in the way that they tried to utilize resources, even though something might not be down as core funding. In the way that some partners are trying to earmark funding at a country level, they're trying to be relatively soft in the way they do it. For example, supporting country frameworks, collective country frameworks and action. And that's an important thing to remember. Just moving on to two quick other lessons that we looked at, or issues we looked at. That was around humanitarian response for one of them. I think we can see from the graph, and I think people know that humanitarian, the proportion of ODA, which is humanitarian, has grown enormously over recent years and continues to do so. Development partners understood that. I mean, they also understood that securing political and public backing for humanitarian aid was often much easier than it was for development, for a variety of reasons, and there were perhaps issues there about the need to better find ways of communicating the importance of development to all sorts of constituencies. But there's also maybe lessons we can always learn from humanitarian support in terms of some of the instruments that have been developed around the SURF and around collective action, and also some of the new work that's been going on around anticipatory action, for example. There might be interesting things to look at there. And also the fact that some donors have started working particularly on areas around nexus funding as well, and how some of those issues could be looked at and strengthened. Then on international finance institutions, which in this case largely we're talking about the development banks, recognizing some of the strengths that they've been able to build and have direct links with financial institutions, finance ministries, and obviously multi-year funding, and that maybe there's a lot of lessons that we could try and look at with colleagues around how that works, how that could be made to work to some extent across the system more widely, without everybody becoming a development bank, of course. Finally, just to stress, we've also, as part of the report, started developing recommendations. Some of those have been shared with partners, They very much remain work in progress. We're very interested in comments. Some partners who have seen them have already provided us with some useful comments. We're trying to use them in a way which comes up with practical measures, which might be things that people can think about and discuss. So they kind of intended to promote discussion. We've grouped them by bilateral partners, by partner countries, and then also the other two groups of multilateral partners and NGOs and think tanks. I'm not going to go into them now, but I think they're there. We're very much interested in feedback, and very interested to hear what people have to think. And then finally, thank you very much. I'll take up more of your time, but very, very, sort of thanks for listening. We very much look forward to engaging further on these issues. And thanks for the team for the work.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you to the team for these good grounds for thoughts and reflection and ways forward. I think many of us recognize many of the things you presented, and at the same time, I really think you're laying ground for what can be different choices onwards. Before I go to our panel, I will give the floor to Jennifer Topping, who is the Executive Director of the UN Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office. Over to you, Jennifer, for your reflections.
Thanks very much, Ulrika. I guess first sound and video check. Everything is loud and clear. Okay, good.
It is.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and happy UN General Assembly Week. I know those of us who are sitting in New York, that's why I put the flags behind me today and the sun shining on the UN building. Hopefully it's symbolic of what we're looking forward to. Thanks for this opportunity to add some reflections and share some of the relevance of this really important work to much of the work that we've seen and done in looking at UN system financing and the types of quality funding for the multilateral system that we've worked on over several years. So congrats to the team for the good work done and moving it into the December, building this path to the December event. So Ulrika, thanks for your opening remarks too, because I think that really framed very well the reasons and the importance of why we're here. So a few reflections. First of all, I would say one on timeliness. This paper really comes at a time, and Ulrika alluded to this in your opening, where the multilateral system, as we know, is under a new set of pressure points. So on pandemic response, on a new and ever more important need to respond to climate change impacts, on SDG reversals, on conflict, etc., the economy. But that requires a better understanding of both the challenges and the opportunities on how we build the multilateral partnerships of member states with international organizations, civil society, private sector to tackle these. So with that set of pressure points and today's version of those pressure points and tomorrow's, how do we make sure we're understanding those accurately in order to build the types of multilateral coalition systems and responses. So that's the timeliness point. Based on the work that we've been doing on looking at financing across the UN system, on pooled and coalition financing in particular, we're really aware that there is a really strong need for accessible and actionable information, data, evidence to underpin this, and on how the multilateral system functions and is funded, and how funding and functions align in the context of today and looking on the challenges of tomorrow, and how those resources are invested and why. And it's that evidence and fact-based that is particularly important now. So we've invested in a new generation of a stepped up even further next generation transparency portal, so that all that data is even more accessible publicly. And we just launched yesterday, I think Eric will probably also refer to this, our colleague from the Commerce Gold Foundation, a new report that we produce annually on financing the UN development system, and this one with a particular focus, and therefore the title, on joint responsibilities in a world in disarray, is what we call it, and that very much aligns with what Ulrika was pointing to in the opening and Graham's comments. So this paper that Graham just summarized and the work done already is really an important that qualitative evidence and the perceptions and underpinning the quantitative work that's out there, and the data that we have, really taken together, helps us better understand those pressures, and therefore be able to design even better and smarter solutions for the forward-looking challenges. So I would say in that regard, based on the work that we have and the alignment with the paper, I would highlight just maybe a couple of points of convergence from the financial data evidence base and the analysis we've done with the points that Graham has just highlighted on the paper. So maybe first and foremost, the paper, as we've heard, has a number of really important reflections on the quality of multilateral funding. And the funding compact gets to this on the UN system side, both in quantity and quality, but with a strong emphasis on the type of funding. And one of our speakers, PR at the launch of the report yesterday, opened with a line which was, we get the UN system, we fund. And so the nature and quality of the funding of the system impacts very strongly on the quality of response and effective results. So the quality of funding, flexible resources, core resources, interagency pooled funds that help to encourage those multilateral coalitions are all elements of that quality that really underpin the kind of ability to have smart design of financing instruments, and some of these other findings that the report and the paper that Graham just summarized points to, and our work highlights this. Unfortunately, what we see amongst a few positive trends in some of that quality funding, the pooled funding has gone up a bit, and that looks like it's heading more or less according to target, but possibly an unambitious target, arguably an unambitious target. But unfortunately, really what we see is that more projectized, more earmarked, less flexible funding is what's growing still very quickly. So that share of earmarked funding in the UN development system over the past 10 years has increased from 51 to 62% of the overall funding of the system. And within that earmarked funding, about 70% of it, so the vast majority of that largest share, goes to single donor, single agency projects. And so it's not even the kind of earmarked funding which is soft or more flexible. So this, of course, as we know, the impact of it is affects really the system's capacity to deliver those integrated and strategic responses at scale, which is what the paper calls for. Second point, quickly, I know we're short on time, or yes. There's lots of people ahead, but quickly I'll go through. I think the interesting point of reflection to think about in this regard is that profile seems really to contradict with some of the reasons that the paper highlights that partners value the UN system and the multilateral system. So as it says, the value of the multilateral system, the priority of partners placed on the ability of UN entities to have a whole of system approach to the SDGs, or to be an effective partner for support of norms, the normative systems, rules-based systems, standards, and the capacity of the UN to mobilize in crisis and high risk situations. So all of those things that it's confirmed that partners value the most in the UN system around system approaches, norms, crisis, are exactly the ones where tightly earmarked projectized type of funding undermines those values. So there is a point of tension and a point of contradiction, I think, and that's an interesting point for discussion.
Jennifer, I believe we have to, because of time. I see we're with more than a 10 minutes delay, so
yeah, okay. Yeah. So I'll wrap up. There's other points that we can come in with later on, maybe in the discussion, but I think those are probably the most important points of reality and reflection related to the pressure points of today and the evidence we have. And maybe just the more upbeat point to reflect on as we go forward is, it's that crisis and opportunity type of paradigm, that when you have pressure points, that can generate new energy, just the same way as in kind of traditional medicine, when you're releasing the pressure points and it creates new energy. So hopefully the types of pressures we're facing now and these sorts of conversations and the work that we're doing allows us to kind of channel that energy into smarter multilateral cooperation. So we look forward to working with everyone on that. Thanks, Ulrika.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks for all the work that you do also to enable, in reality, the coordination, but also to do the reflections with regards to the importance of a coordinated approach and the times that we're in. I will now, without further ado, hand over to you, Mr. Erik Engberg, who is Program Manager at Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and also close partner to the UN Development System. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ulrika, and thank you so much for inviting the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and me to speak at this panel and for delivering this very timely and interesting report. I would like to build a little bit on some of the statements that were made earlier around we get the UN that we fund, and even from the report observing that the multilateral system is effective, but the effectiveness depends also on how partners support that system. This is true. We would also like to build on that and describe how focusing on the principles of effective development cooperation, maybe we can help to mobilize more funding of a higher quality. So basically, the arrows of causality can go in both directions. As Jennifer mentioned, the results from the funding compact after 3 years are mixed. We have an increase in pool funding. We also have a decrease in core funding. And at this point, it would be interesting to look at why do we get these results and how can we move forward with the funding compact and with the development effectiveness principles. So last year, the foundation carried out a study on the implementation of the funding compact, which was commissioned by the UN DCO. And we did a large number of interviews in 6 different countries. And we really found that a lot of the critical success factors in mobilizing better quality funding were very tightly aligned with the development effectiveness principles. For example, we spoke to a lot of different member state representatives and UN entities in the field that emphasized that national ownership and national leadership was very important to bring stakeholders together, to plan together, and also enable stakeholders to come together for these funding dialogues, which are really important then to mobilize more flexible and predictable funding. Another good example is that several member states emphasized the need for more policy dialogue and more inclusive partnerships to unlock more of this flexible funding. For example, policy dialogue that could help to bring bilateral development strategies and UN development cooperation frameworks tighter together could be one way of facilitating the mobilization of flexible resources. Another way, and maybe one of the explanations by the increase in pool funding, is that pool fundings also, through their steering committees, can provide this space for a policy dialogue between UN member states, UN entities, and national authorities. So these are two of the principles that came out very strongly in our research that also closely align with the effectiveness principles. And then thirdly, at the global level, when we talk about the allocation of core funding, several member states emphasized the importance of transparency and saying that, you know, they would really like to know a bit more how core funding helps to benefit national development priorities, so that when they meet with host country governments, they can more easily make the case that we are providing also this core funding that is also supporting your government in different ways. So there you see how the transparency angle also relates very strongly to the funding compact and to the mobilization of more core funding. So I think, and then finally, we have the principle on results, which is, as you mentioned, Ulrika, the most important one. And this is also something that came out very strongly in our research and in our report that we launched together with the Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office yesterday and that Jennifer mentioned. There we have a section on the latest data that provides, you know, up-to-date data on funding trends for the UN system. But we also have a marketplace of ideas where different authors from within and outside the UN system provide their ideas on a wide array of issues, but also on results. And I would encourage everyone also to have a look at this report, because it provides a lot of perspectives on how we can further improve results and adopt innovative approaches. For example, when it comes to providing global public goods, channeling private sector resources, and also scaling up development and climate interventions. So maybe by focusing even more on these type of innovative concepts, we can make an even stronger case for better quality funding. So just to summarize my intervention here, wanted to emphasize that the arrow goes both ways. Quality funding can improve our effectiveness, but also the effectiveness principles can help us to mobilize better funding. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric. And that is, it can do that if we have perhaps more innovative ways of presenting what we actually have found throughout the years. Now, without further ado, I have the pleasure to go to the panel, and I am happy to start to give the floor to Ms. Helen Edwards, who's the Director General for International Development Cooperation at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Sweden. Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ulrika, and thank you also for arranging today's event, and thank you to my co-speakers for very interesting contributions so far. This is a really timely, as someone said before me, event, and of course a very important report. We are in a situation we're all aware of the need to step up the implementation of the Agenda 2030 and Addis Ababa agenda. We're facing a number of interlinked crises, while at the same time we are challenged by limited resources and competing priorities. And of course, this makes development effectiveness more important than ever. And in order to be more effective, we really need to work better together. And the Secretary General framed this very well in the Common Agenda when he spoke about how the world must come together to work on, for example, protecting global goods, addressing the climate crisis, and so on. And if we are serious about realizing the SDGs and leaving no one behind, we must work better together. All development stakeholders must get engaged. And of course, multilateral cooperation is part of that success story. As shown in the excellent report of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation on UN funding, multilateral cooperation does take a big and growing share of ODA. Sweden, for example, channels well over half its development cooperation through multilateral organization. And this reflects the Swedish conviction that multilateral organizations can deliver effectively, both in their operational and normative roles, and also, as Graham pointed out, in their role as a convening power. And the principles for effective development cooperation is really of a foundational guidance for us as we strive to make the UN system even more impactful. We need a multilateralism that strengthens local ownership, is resource-focused, inclusive, and transparent. And the adherence to the principles should be an explicit priority in both policy and practice of the multilateral organizations. And there are several monitoring exercises that show that multilateral organizations generally score well on how they live up to the principles of effective development cooperation. And that is indeed very encouraging. At the same time, there is no doubt potential to increase the effectiveness of both individual organizations and the multilateral system as a whole, even further. And again, as the SG has pointed out in our common agenda, UN reform has been and continues to be central to that end. And he writes, effective multilateralism depends on an effective United Nations, one able to adapt to global challenges while living up to the purposes and principles of its charter. And as pointed out in today's report, the effectiveness of multilateral organizations also largely depends on how partners support the system, and many of the previous speakers have already pointed to this. Time and again, we can see how funding that is predictable and flexible contributes positively to the effectiveness of multilateral organizations. But we also see that earmarked contributions continue to grow faster than core contributions within the UN system. And this is a challenge that must be addressed. We must join forces to implement the UN Funding Compact as a means to increase development effectiveness. And needless to say, the multilateral organizations themselves must also do their part to demonstrate that they are cost effective, have adequate systems, and are able to prevent irregularities. And just as we need to incorporate the multilateral perspective in our discussion on development effectiveness needs to be part of the discussion in multilateral forums. It must also be incorporated into specific ongoing process, such as discussions on financing for development and on the humanitarian development peace nexus. Just before wrapping up, I'd like to say that we're very honored as Sweden to be taking over after Switzerland the donor co-chairmanship of the Global Partnership at the summit in December, representing then both bilateral and multilateral donors. We are greatly looking forward to work with you all in this capacity. So thank you so much for arranging today's event. We are looking forward not only to the discussion today, but of course also the ongoing work in the summit in December, where we will be able to continue this important conversation on multilateral aspects of development effectiveness. So thank you, Ulrika, and all the rest of you for this event today. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you for taking over that co-chair. That will be very important, of course, for driving the global partnership forward. Now it's time to give the floor to Ms. Viviana Manrique, who is the Director General at APC in Colombia. Bienvenida. Let's see, Viviana, if we have you with us. Or...
Good morning.
Good morning. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Distinguished participants, to the Global Partnership, panelists, and worldwide audience. I kindly thank the organizers for inviting the Presidential Agency of International Cooperation, APC Colombia, to present their view on the effectiveness of the multilateral system as a dual country. Certainly, the voices from Global South must always be taken into consideration in plural scenarios of dialogue, especially when we are heading to the next effective development cooperation summit that will take place in December 2022. A few months ago, we participated in an interesting validation webinar with the GPDC team on effective donorship and multilateral support that led us to critical reflections. Today, I want to share 3 ideas regarding our experience as an international cooperation agency from the Global South, working with the UN system, the international financial institutions, and other international non-state actors engaged in development cooperation schemes in Colombia. The first idea remarks on the link between the evolution of the concept of aid effectiveness and the country-owned development processes. The second idea is regarding the mechanisms implemented by Colombia to operationalize the country's ownership around official development assistance, ODA processes, emphasizing multilateral partners. And finally, the third idea will focus on the expected added value of UN agencies and IFIs according to Colombia's ODA recipient and South-South cooperation provider. Firstly, while the world is becoming more multilateral with emerging cooperation partners and evolving accountability systems, the challenges around collaboration and cooperation with the stakeholders remain tangible. Though not always see eye-to-eye languages, incentives, and expectations vary from one actor to another, shaping and diversifying the development action. In this sense, through the lens of effectiveness principles, governance and country ownership embraces the needed guidance to assure the 5 Cs: coordination, consensus, collaboration, complementation, and contribution. In 2000, the new millennium began to renew efforts toward a more comprehensive view of international cooperation within the global system. Together, the Paris Declaration in 2005, Accra's Agenda of Actions in 2008, and Busan's high-level forums in 2011 set the foundation of today's aim to build a more horizontal platform for action beyond vertical donor-recipient relationships. Interdependent partners in the development to leverage knowledge and resources for the sake of prosperity through international cooperation. Paris aid effectiveness principles, ownership, alignment, harmonization, managing for results, and mutual accountability. And Accra's Agenda of Action declared that stronger and more inclusive partnerships cannot engage effectively and sustainable in country-owned development processes without state leadership. Busan's high-level Forum on Aid Effectiveness emphasized that development belongs to all. So meeting its aid principle is a shared duty to all partners involved. Building on the monitoring framework endorsed in Busan and the Kampala principles, the members should stay committed to facilitating country leadership, people's participation, and accountability on development processes to achieve the Nairobi commitment. Secondly, Colombia understands country ownership as a driver for development. Thus, national cooperation systems shall reflect development effectiveness beyond narratives through genuine mechanisms for multi-stakeholder partnership on its national result frameworks. When international cooperation is oriented, measured, and followed up by inclusive and participatory governance, it mitigates risks of duplicity, harmful intervention, aid dependence, and increased bureaucracy. Since 2007, the Colombian government has undertaken complementary strategies to its national development plan by introducing specific frameworks and instruments for international cooperation according to the nature, roles, and expected outcomes of these partners in the country. I will mention 4 of them. 1, Colombia established a national strategy of international cooperation every 4 years. This is the main framework to set priorities and mechanisms to guide international non-reimbursable cooperation that the country receives and potentially offers. The first strategy focuses on ODA. A few years later, it evolved to include South-South and triangular cooperation to reflect the emerging role of Colombia as a technical cooperation provider. Our current strategy emphasizes that our development will only be possible with effective engagement and mutual accountability among multiple actors: national, regional, and local governments, cooperation agencies, private enterprise, philanthropy, academia, and civil society. 2, The National System of International Cooperation was established by law in 2022 to enhance institutional capabilities and coordinate international cooperation at local levels. Law enforcement not only allows the strategy, programmatic, and operational scenarios for international cooperation in Colombia to be aligned to foreign policy and domestic needs. It also offers practical guidelines regarding project technical, financial, and knowledge management. 3, cooperation frameworks with strategic partners are negotiated based on the national priorities where international cooperation provides value added in support of the public policy. For instance, as a result of a one-year round of negotiations with the UN system, the United Nations Framework for Sustainable Development, UNSDCF 2020-2023, with 3 thematic areas: peace, migration, and SDGs accelerators, came out along with relevant adjustments. A new configuration of the UN national team and a new model of intervention according to each UN agency's scope, expertise, and capabilities. A more profound UN interagency work, territorial, sectorial driven interventions, national appropriation, strategy, alliances, and transparency. And monitoring an evaluation plan with indicators and accountability instruments of report and analysis. 3, sustainability strategies, alignment, capacity building, and knowledge management. 2 joint teams between UN and government officials. 1, the results group, and 2, the fallout, evaluation, and knowledge management group. Besides the framework, APC Colombia also establishes annual plans with each UN agency and yearly reports on the projects, financial flows, lesson learned, and recommendation as a way to capture and analyze relevant data. All this information becomes inputs for planning strategies and future decision-making policies. 4, Colombia established a validation mechanism with international development banks before the implementation of any development intervention in the country. The Colombian government requires all multilateral development banks operating in the country to request national consultation, not an objection mechanism, throughout APC Colombia for all development projects in the design phase. Despite implementing all these frameworks, plans, and mechanisms that I mentioned as a government, we still face challenges in coordination and sustainability at a local level where unaligned actions of multiple organizations undermine development effectiveness. 3, the third idea is regarding the expected added value of UN agency. We've identified some opportunities for improvements in the multilateral organization support to national governments. Multilateral organizations often become the main implementer of international cooperation resources and the public budget, leaving local ONGs out of the game, reducing local capacity and incrementing dependency. The dynamics of multilateral schemes of cooperation tend to be costly due to high overhead. When a cooperation project is implemented with the support of an international partner with more significant local presence and recognition than the state itself, the visibility and contribution of public institutions get vanished. Triangular cooperation has enormous room to be developed and deepened by our multilateral partners. The multilateral global capillarity should benefit knowledge sharing in the global south. I want to finish my intervention by acknowledging the potential and capabilities of multilateral actors to contribute to development processes and subsidiary support to country efforts. And I want to point out clear opportunities to add value to multilateral effectiveness. Commitments, guidelines, and principles should be evenly now and clearly understood by national and local delegates across the UN country network. Development intervention must include third-party implementers and civil society collaborators to enhance local capacities, reduce dependency, and strengthen alignment with local priorities. UN agencies and international financial institutions hold international recognition for their expertise, methodological approach, and knowledge products. Those capabilities should be considered to identify and promote local achievements, cutting-edge, advanced, and community-based innovation to help validate the new knowledge generated domestically before the international community. Resource mobilization carried out by multilateral partners should be strategical platforms to attract non-traditional partners and new stakeholders to invest and work collaboratively and in innovative mechanisms for international cooperation beyond traditional ODA. Increased resources are needed to promote knowledge sharing among Global South partners, expand the benefits of development processes through triangular cooperation, and leverage blended finance and impact investing initiatives where public institutions lack experience. I want to thank the organizers for your kind invitation and mostly for facilitating insightful dialogues to us or ourselves to encourage better and more effective partnership for the development and hopefully provide value inputs for December's summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Viviana, for giving us a great example how we can see how to strengthen country ownership and development effectiveness. Really interesting to listen to you. Without further ado, handing the floor, the virtual floor, over to Mr. Richard Sesi Kirianga, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Basic Research, CPDE co-chair. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Chair. And first and foremost is to congratulate all of you for giving us this opportunity to talk about multilateralism and how we can use it as a tool for transformative development. I'll make a few points in the 6 minutes that you have given me. One is, yes, I like the report. The report has been very interesting in terms of pointing out some of the areas that we could explore more. But I was asked to reflect a bit about on the opportunities and challenges, especially for us as civil society. I come from the Civil Society Partnership for Development Effectiveness, which is a global platform that reaches over 140 countries around the world. And we engage on issues of development effectiveness very closely. But one of the things which I think would be important to note, especially in this discussion on multilateralism, is that, as someone has said before, that the collective and global consensus is clear that multilateralism and multi-stakeholder partnerships are very, very critical for us to be able to achieve anything, and they are central in our ability to respond to all the things that we see. And the things that we see that, everybody is talking about, we know the climate crisis, for example, is really one that will only be solved through multilateralism because it goes beyond any borders. When we come to the pandemic, that is also true. When we come to the wars that are all over the world, that is also true. And even when we think about questions of inequality and how we shall respond to them, we still need to think about how multilateralism can play a role. So I think that the UN and other multilateral institutions now have a historical responsibility to step up, but also to work innovatively and to work in different ways with other partners, especially those who are not in government, like civil society, the private sector, and other partners. The other important point I would like to make is I think the convening power is also a big opportunity that we should all leverage on, and that is the convening power of the UN. But the convening power has to also be used very carefully because it can also become a way of exclusion rather than inclusion. And what that means is that we must make sure that the UN does not become a global bureaucracy in a sense, but it becomes a global facilitating mechanism that will allow us to openly engage and to expand. The good thing is that the SDGs have given us that opportunity to actually start seeing some of that ability for us to come around and convene under the UN as a body. The other point I would like to make around the opportunities is the question of national ownership that has been touched on in many ways. The only thing I want to add to that is that when we talk about national ownership, I think we should be talking about it as an opportunity if and only if it is described and understood as democratic ownership, as inclusive ownership, as citizen-led ownership. Because when ownership is just about a government in power ownership, as the report told us a little bit when I read it, then it loses out. So this is something I think which is a responsibility for all of us to ensure that we do that. And for us and CPDE, when we talk about domesticating and localizing the effectiveness principles, these are the questions that we try to bring at country level through our country level work. I want to end by saying that there are 3 roles that we think we can be able to play. And one, of course, is, as I said, to ensure that this whole question of ownership is not only promoted, but domesticated across the countries around the world. I think we have to do that so that we can expand the opportunities and the possibilities for local accountability, and also the opportunities for mutual accountability at a local level and also at a global level. But also, I think when we talk about multilateralism, we have to understand that there is a real responsibility that has to happen in countries, that multilateralism should also expand the opportunities for discussions to happen in countries, across regions, to help and make sure that solutions in one end can be used in another place. And lastly, on issues of financing, is also to ensure that we find innovative ways in which we can expand the resource envelopes. We know that there is quite a big shrink right now of resources going to civil society, with the private sector being privileged in many ways, and very little and projectized resources always going to civil society. And so we need to find innovative ways in which we can do resource mobilization that leverages even on local philanthropy and local resource mobilization. So I would like to end by saying that for me, these are some of the areas that we could explore as we think about effective multilateralism and how it can influence the world that we live in. I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I actually started accompanying the partnership from the civil society side. And on this day of democracy, I think a good reminder that the partnership is really about inclusive partnerships beyond government, with the private sector, with academia, but also with civil society. And this, as you said, also goes for the sustainable development goals. So we do have the frameworks, and I think we need to look closer into how we make this happen for real. Without further ado now, it's time for Mr. Francisco Castro Ortiz, who is the lead economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. And I believe, Francisco, you will start, and then you will also hand over the floor to Rosangela Bando-Grana a couple of minutes. So over to you, both of you.
Thank you very much. I hope my connection is well. We are honored to have been invited to this timely and important panel discussion. The report is welcomed, and in general, we agree with its findings and recommendations. It provides a good picture of the heterogeneity of perspectives of the development finance architecture, or international financial architecture as called by the G20, which also analyzed the subject through an expert panel back in 2018. We would like to focus our comments on 2 of the GPDC's report's findings. First, while we could say that the consensus on the 4 GPDC principles is embedded in most multilaterals, if not all, namely country ownership, partnerships, results, and accountability and transparency, we agree with the report that national ownership in particular of multilaterals may mean different things to different actors. In this sense, broadly speaking, multilaterals, according to the report, could be divided in 2 groups, UN System 1s and MDBs. Second, there seems to be a consensus around 3 key themes where multilaterals navigate, namely country ownership access, foreign policy objectives, and international norms and values. Likewise, the perception that there is a trilemma among them where the pursuit of 2 precludes the third one. allow us to elaborate more on the MDB perspective with respect to these findings. Speaking as an economist, the trilemma could be seen as an optimization problem, and the MDB business model could be considered to propose an equilibrium solution. First, with respect to ownership, MDBs like the IDB are owned by their shareholders, which include borrowing and non-borrowing members alike, which provided the ordinary capital with which the MDBs were founded. Capital provision is provided based on a cooperative model based on the level of development of each shareholder, so that those who can pay more do so. And capital is linked to voting power, so ownership differs from UN institutions where each country equals 1 vote. Because all shareholders provided the original founding capital, we could say that all shareholders in MDBs are donors, which explains the strong sense of ownership, of country ownership of MDBs vis-a-vis UN institutions, where there's a clear distinction of the donor group. Ownership is even stronger in regional development banks, where developing countries as a group have a significant voting power, and in the case of the IDB in particular, borrowers have the voting power majority. Second, with respect to foreign policy objectives, the voting power structure facilitates reaching consensus, particularly in regional development banks, where decisions require more than single majorities. At the IDB, for example, many resolutions require voting majority, regional majority, and borrowers majority. This system levels the playing field of the advanced and developing shareholders. Furthermore, decisions are taken by a board of directors where MDB officials, elected rather than appointed by the respective capitals, become bank officials with a fiduciary duty for the well-being of the cooperative. While they reflect their capital's foreign policy objectives, they are accountable to the cooperator, to the cooperative or the bank. Third, with respect to international norms and values, they are embedded in MDB work in several dimensions. On the one hand, MDBs like the IDB abide to their development mandates, which stem from principles in their articles of agreement that enjoy international consensus. On the other, MDBs are also a source of best practices on development effectiveness, which are the product of more than 5 decades of, in the case of IDB, 6, on development and development interventions and lessons learned on what works and what does not. Third, as actors of the IFA, of the International Financial Architecture, MDBs participate, contribute, and adopt principles agreed in global fora such as the G20, the Financing for Development Conferences of the United Nations, or the GPDC. These 3 elements are closely linked to country access and are reflected in how MDBs maximize the collective de-risking in the so-called trilemma. First, with respect to country access, rather than seeing MDBs as from a donor perspective, MDBs should be seen as financial intermediaries. Central to our work is leveraging our capital base in markets and multiply the funds several times to put them to use for development. A dollar in managed by MDBs results more in a dollar out in financing for development, maximizing the impact of scarce resources. On average, when shareholders invest $1 in MDBs, MDBs can commit $2 to $5 in new financing per year. This allows for effective financial support in fragile environments and crises such as the pandemic, where the IDB disbursed and mobilized a record 24 billion. And aggregate MDB support was around 170 billion combined, which was provided to the G20 debt service sustainable initiative by maintaining positive net flows to developing countries. Second, with respect to collective de-risking, the multiplier effect of pooling and leveraging our capital is related to characteristics of the MDB business model, namely the AAA rating and the preferred creditor treatment, which enables MDBs to raise money in markets and lend it at concessional or preferential rates to borrowers. Collective de-risking is also expanded further on the sovereign lending side through the deployment of the leverage resources via dedicated instruments such as investment and policy-based loans and guarantees, special development loans for crisis and emergency response, catastrophic bonds for natural disasters, and local currency solutions, which are becoming really attractive. On the non-sovereign lending side, this is done through loans and guarantees, syndications, thematic or green bonds, local currency financing, and blended finance, among others. In addition, MDBs like the IDB are also testing with success innovative de-risking approaches with multiplier effects by partnering with donors. For instance, the portfolio guarantee that we have with that was provided by the Swedish International Development Agency to manage concentration in upper middle income countries and redeploying the freed lending capacity in lower middle income countries. Many of these innovation proposals can be consulted in IDB's Vision 2025 documents, which is available online. And third, the value of this financial leverage is complemented by other fiduciary oversight, where the development effectiveness of MDB interventions play a central role, with the aim that they contribute to help countries generate, attract, and manage additional flows to support sustainable development. On this, I will let my colleague Rosangela to say a few words on how development effectiveness is critical to IDB work, but allow me finally just to say that these words were not intended to compare MDBs and UN agencies with a competition perspective, but rather to understand the differences, comparative advantages, and build on the respective complementarities to increase the effectiveness of the multilateral system, or optimizing within the trilemma as mentioned. Speaking again as an economist, heterogeneity can be beneficial because of the diversification effect of the availability of complementary options. And the example was the SIDA guarantee mentioned before, where with 100 million from Sweden, through a pari passu guarantee, the IDB managed to address the concentration in Brazil and leverage 300 million extra for smaller countries like Bolivia. So in this sense, a better division of labor among multilateral actors could be possible by building on key comparative strengths. For example, all MDBs can mobilize climate finance, but the United Nations could be better suited to finance climate mitigation because of their stake in global commons, such as oceans. Whereas MDBs like the IDB may have an advantage in responding to climate adaptation in individual countries because of our client proximity and affinity. And thank you, and over to Rosangela.
Thank you, Paco. And let me, first of all, thank you and join the rest of the panelists congratulating the authors for this very timely and relevant analysis. We're very happy to have the opportunity to participate in this panel. I would just like to share that the ultimate goal at IDB is to improve lives, and improving lives really demand we produce tangible results. And understanding this since 2008, the IDB has relied on a set of tools available under an umbrella that we call the Development Effectiveness Framework, or the DEF. And this DEF seeks to provide incentives to guide project teams to achieve the results that we promise when projects are approved by the board of directors. At the design stage, we score projects based on a checklist of good practices standards, so that the incentives are aligned with designing evidence-based projects. This checklist aims to incentivize the use of cost-effective investments, the alignment with country needs and strategic priorities, and the establishment of appropriate monitoring, risk management, and evaluation mechanisms. During project execution, the system helps us identify problems, mitigate risks when they materialize, and sometimes redirect the operation if the operative environment demands so. At closure, we evaluate projects, all projects, based on evidence on the achievement of these objectives that were promised when the project was approved. And the purpose of this project, which by the way is a public report, is to provide key stakeholders and shareholders with key information on project performance, so that we learn what worked, what didn't work, and it's also an important tool for accountability. We see the implementation of the Development Effectiveness Framework not as a static evaluation tool. It's not just whether we're doing things right or wrong, that's part of it, but it's also an important tool for collaboration in the medium run that help us align incentives. It demands investments to measure results, but in exchange, what we get is this evidence that we hope that will create this dynamic conversation that will help us bridge some challenges that sometimes when we collaborate, we face. For example, this tension that is highlighted in the report between the three themes: ownership, policy, norms. We cannot solve it, in one round. We need to kind of use evidence, and hopefully this evidence will help us converge to effective development through evidence-based decision making. So thank you very much, and I hand it over back to Paco. I don't know if you have anything else to say.
Nothing. We're open to questions or further follow-up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francisco and Rosangela, for really also showcasing how you work in a wide range of partnerships in very innovative ways as a regional development bank. Very encouraging. Now it is time, and we are a bit behind schedule, but still this will be really one of the interesting parts, I believe. We will have a open discussion, and I'm now handing over the floor to our lead discussant, Mr. Rahul Malhotra, who's the head of Division Reviews, Results, Evaluation and Development Innovation at the Development Cooperation Directorate. Over to you, Rahul.
Great, thank you very much, Ulrika, and I'm delighted to be a lead discussant in this really important conversation. What I'll do is offer some very brief remarks from my vantage point of working at the OECD and reviewing and assessing OECD Development Assistance Committee member policy, systems and behaviours on a day-to-day basis. And for those of you that don't know, the Development Assistance Committee is the body that sits at the OECD, consisting of 30 of the largest providers of development assistance in the world. And they set the rules and the norms and the standards and monitor the rules, norms and standards around ODA. But while I'm talking, we do really want to encourage some Q&A and discussion at the end, even if we are running a little bit behind time. So while I'm talking, I would encourage participants to this session to please raise your hands or put in a question or comment in the chat while I'm talking. And we'll see if we can get some very quick reactions from the panelists and from the other speakers at the end. So Ulrika, colleagues, I think the first thing I want to say is that it's quite hard to argue with some of the key tenets of this discussion and the paper in front of us. I think we can all agree that multilateralism is more important than ever. I think there is this sort of burning sense that we are at a crossroads or a critical juncture in terms of multilateral system and how we support or enable that system, and particularly in light of, as many of you mentioned, the sort of compounding crises that are in front of us. I think we can also agree that the title of this session, Spaces for Change, is quite appropriate. I think we need spaces for change. I think we need spaces for dialogue. I think we need spaces for pooling risk and resources. And I think we need spaces for leveraging additional finance, because ODA will never be enough. I think we also agree that we need both normative and we need operational delivery, with value for money running through that delivery mechanism. And I think we can all agree, and I think we've all spoken to this, that the effectiveness principles are highly relevant lenses through which to collectively work towards a multilateral system that is fit for purpose. So I think none of that's controversial. I think we can agree on that. But let me be a little bit provocative as lead discussant, if you allow me. And I want to add two sort of sets of questions or reflections to the discussion that actually builds on what Jennifer, Eric, and Francisco have been saying as well, and taking more of a system-wide view. And the two issues really are loosely around mandates and around funding. And they are interrelated, and they are fundamentally about incentives in the system. So on mandates, the latest data that we have is that 10 multilateral organizations account for 70% of total multilateral outflows. Yet in each ODA eligible country, we see on average 20 active multilateral organizations, and actually it's many more in many countries, in addition to this complex landscape of bilateral civil society and other actors and partners. So this clearly creates challenges around coherence, coordination, transaction costs on the partner government and society, and ultimately could risk elements of country ownership. So my first question around mandates is, why is this happening? Why do some multilateral mandates overlap? Why do some bilaterals contribute to or enable this fragmentation? And how can we flip it? How can we drive efficiencies and scale and reconcile some of the competing interests? And how can we really start that process pragmatically and nudge behaviors towards more consolidation and higher order impacts in line with the SDGs? So that's my first set of issues. And the second is relatedly around funding. So ODA is a finite resource. The demands on it are very high. The scrutiny of it, both domestically and internationally, is equally high. Now, bilateral ODA, which is about 74% of total ODA in 2020, serves a purpose. It has its own strategic, political, historical logic and added value. Multilateral organizations should, in principle, create a space for collective action to address complex, knotty, sometimes very political challenges where it makes sense to work under a multilateral umbrella rather than bilateral. So the question here is, and I think Francisco and Eric and Jennifer spoke to this, the question is, are both ends of this system actually speaking to their comparative advantage? And if they are, then why is there an increasing share of ODA being earmarked rather than going through core funding? So we know 16% of total ODA in 2020 was earmarked, and 26% of total ODA was core. And the core has been flatlining, and the earmarking over time has been increasing. So we know this is suboptimal. We know it's creating clear operating pressures for multilateral organizations, but let's ask ourselves the honest question: what is the push and what is the pull? We often hear, for example, from bilateral donors in the DAC, for example, that both visibility concerns and national geopolitical interests are very real and important domestically for the bilateral donors, as are the efficiencies they can get from and the trust they have in the multilateral system. These are real drivers for behaviors, and we need to understand why the behaviors are moving in one way and not the other. So it comes back to, I think, Jennifer's sort of paradox. And it's like, how can we address this pragmatically? I think the arguments, and I've made these arguments in the DAC before, that core is good and non-core is bad, is not washing. It's not making any change, let's face it. So what's the middle ground? What instruments and modalities would meet the strategic interests of both the multilateral system and the bilateral actors and demonstrate good faith on both sides? I think that for me is the question where we really need to get some very honest conversation going. So let me end there, and let me also end by saying that some of the data that I've gone through today is from a forthcoming OECD publication called the Multilateral Development Finance Report, which we'll be launching in November. And I do believe this will be a vital contribution to the debate around mandates, around reform, and around enablers of the multilateral system. So we look forward to launching it with all of you, and also as an input to the summit in December. And let me also say, I personally, and I think, you know, every one of us working at the OECD, we're committed to benchmarking good bilateral donor practice around the interaction with the multilateral system. And we really want to support this effort towards effective multilateral donorship. So with that, let me see if we have any raised hands or comments in the chat. I don't see any raised hands. And okay, so we have a question here for IADB. And thank you for bringing up the importance of UN and MDBs to leverage each other's comparative advantages to create sustainable and innovative solutions on the ground. What do you think is needed to advance that even further? Francisco, would you like to take a shot at that?
Yes, well, it's a very general question, in the sense that I don't know if I have the answer, but I could provide means that can help to bridge the space between both groups of organizations and to find more complementarities. I think very importantly is to participate actively in global fora, like the United Nations or the G20, which have several development, where coordination at the highest level happens, but it's also supported by technical evidence-based data. Another issue that I think could help also to advance us further is how we, and this also goes to the point that you, Raul, mentioned about, how ODA and core versus non-core funding is evolving. I think another element is also how the accounting systems, how do we register them? And in this sense, I would like to point out a global initiative that actually started with the 2030 agenda, which is TOSDI, the Total Official Support for Sustainable Development, which seeks actually to harmonize the accounting, not just of ODA, but all the development financing for sustainable and inclusive development. Is a task force where about, I think, 120 countries are participating actively. Most multilaterals are also participating. And I think, this brings convergence to the system. And finally, well, there's this proposal that I believe that my colleague from Colombia mentioned about country platforms, which is an initiative that was conceptualized in the G20 expert panel report. And where MDBs and many stakeholders alike are developing proposals to articulate it. Besides this, I don't know if my colleague Rosangela would like to add something on collaboration on the ground to increase our comparative advantages and complementarities.
Thank you, Paco. No, I mean, as I said, everything is defined by evidence. When we really define the project, we try to identify where are the areas where we need to better work. And I think more than how to say, like registering the funds is making very clear that we are a results-based institution, in the sense that we keep that clear aim and clear view that this is the end goal that we want to pursue. So I think, and I agree, there are some challenges there, but I think in terms of the diagnosis and that in the extent that the systems, the local capacity, and the different agents that participate in the execution really allow to identify these areas where we can really collaborate and achieve those objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosangela and Francisco. We are running out of time, and I want to give Ulrika a few minutes at the end to wrap up, but maybe if I could call on George Hashaka to come in very briefly for your comment or question, then I'll turn to Jennifer and then back to Ulrika. But George, are you there? Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, George Darlington Hashaka is my name, and I'm speaking from Kampala, Uganda. I am the founder executive chairman of Uganda Peace Foundation. I am wondering how multilateralism can work when the 5 members of the UN Security Council violate international law. Well, that is my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, George. Let me turn to Jennifer and then Ulrika. Jennifer, please.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to come in, Raul, quickly on some of those reflections that you made on mandates and funding, and how to kind of, what are some of the things we may have in our collective toolbox to get at that tension a bit more. And I think what we've seen in recent years is when you unpack that picture of a kind of flat line on the quality funding of core and a faster increase in the earmarked and project type funding. If we unpack that a bit more and we see that within that earmarked funding, it's not all tightly earmarked. Much of it is, and that's contributing to this tension. But between a stronger core base and where that curve should be heading up so that agencies can deliver on mandates capably, and then complementing that with the quality of non-core, meaning flexible coalition type platform financing. And that really goes to these types of pools that enable national leadership, pools that pull the UN and the multilateral and the banks system and civil society together. And as Eric was saying, that kind of two-way street led by national, steering bodies, whatever they are, for policy dialogues at the national level and a whole of system approach. Those are, at sometimes they may just look like a financial structure, but the financial structure part of it is only one dimension. The fundamental dimension is that these are structured multilateral coalitions, whether they are, Colombia peace coalitions led with national partners, civil society and the UN, or with a financial instrument behind it, or, more global peace and humanitarian type instruments. So I think therein is the middle ground between that good and bad paradigm. That allows us to have a view that looks at multilateralism by stronger mandates through core, but then initiatives and incentives and instruments that we can structure that pull the other parts together.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Completely agree, and we're certainly becoming more nuanced as well in terms of our own disaggregation and analysis and looking at softer forms of earmarking and the shades of grey in between. So I think there's convergence there, absolutely. Well, thank you all very much. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for discussion, but I think this is just the start of the conversation, and it will continue into December and well beyond. But thank you, Ulrika, again, for hosting and moderating, and back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raoul. Thank you, Graham, and your team for the study. For those of you who have not yet read it, I want to remind you about the opportunity to find it online alongside with important reports, also the one launched by Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and the Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office yesterday. Much more to be done. We started off by just stating the obvious, and that is that the world is not in a very good shape. And I would like to respond to the question with regards to the situation that we have with Security Council members violating also the charter as we are in the first week of our General Assembly. And just to say, since the very first General Assembly back in London that I referred to, we have seen a situation where member states year by year have not had respect for decisions made in the UN. But I strongly believe, and this is also the reason I have come to work with the UN again, I did way back in the 90s, that the only way that we can address the global challenges that we are facing is to strengthen the multilateral system. And the only way of doing that is through effective development cooperation, where we take into account the wide range of actors that are part of the global partnership, that is civil society, that is academia. So we need to base our decisions also on facts. But of course also the private sector to drive finance. And we've had a number of encouraging examples, I believe, with regards to this, how the principles are being taken into account as Colombia tries to have that inclusive dialogue in the country in relation to the development plans of the country being aligned then with the sustainable development goals. From our colleagues in IIDB also looking at how to find new innovative ways of working. Much more to be done, of course, with the opportunity then to use the event, our summit in December, as a platform that requires for all of us on this call, whether you are from civil society, whether you're from south or north, to really make use of the time that we have ahead of the partnership. So don't hesitate to go to the website of GPEDC, where you will find much more information. I saw also questions online with regards to the possibility to participate We will make sure that we have the participation also online, so that as many colleagues across this wide range of partnerships as possible can participate. So thanking all of you for having participated here today, but also really encouraging you to participate towards the important summit that we will have in December. That will also give us an opportunity to come back to the discussions that we have had here today. And to all of you in the panel, I mean, as I said, Graham, thank you so much for the important report. Have a look at it, please, you who are in the audience, but also you will find many of our colleagues here and the organizations and entities they represent online if you are interested to find more information. So on behalf of the UN Development System and UNDP hosting the Secretariat for the Global Partnership, just to say thank you and very much look forward to what we have ahead of us as well. And happy Democracy Day as well, speaking about inclusive ways of working with development. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.